Hello, friends. Welcome back to Colliding Worldviews. Great to have you back here with me again. And also my guest, who's no stranger to this show. He's been here a number of times, and I wanted to have him back because of some news headlines that you may have seen recently. Yes, my guest today is Raymond Ibrahim, author and also Islam and Middle East specialist. Raymond, welcome back to Colliding Worldviews. It's great to have you here, Raymond, because a lot of people are hearing about an event that you were supposed to have recently, and yet that didn't take place. And for people who did hear, it probably lines right up with what you've heard. The U.S. Army War College was supposed to have Raymond come and speak on his brand new book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. This is the book that you need to get, and this is what he was going to be talking about. But guess what? Raymond is an expert in Islam. He is fluent in English, Arabic, and Greek. He's from Egypt. He knows his stuff. He has multiple degrees in history. So of all people who could have spoken there, it would have been Raymond. It should have been Raymond. Raymond, what happened to this event which never took place?
Sure, Tony. So basically, like you said, I was invited back in January, almost 6 months ago, by the War College, and it was a very enthusiastic invitation about my book, as you said, which is about military history, the military history between Islam and the West. And they thought it was a great fit for their faculty, staff, students, and so forth. And we locked in the date, June 19th, and everything was set, and that was the end of it. I got all my ticket and my hotel, my transportation, lodging, and so forth. And then around May 28th, CAIR, as you pointed out, sent a formal concerned letter, and it was all about the quote-unquote deep disappointment of the Muslim community that an Islamophobe like me has been invited to such a prestigious institution, et cetera, et cetera. And it hit some media, and the War College responded by calling me and basically saying, it's on, don't worry about it. We're not even responding to CAIR, and nothing's changed. And I said, good. And then I think the very next day, this is probably like June 6th or 7th, CAIR started a sort of hysterical campaign, which consisted of a press release and also Linda Sarsour's Empower Change group sent out a petition. And the long and short of all of these writings was to basically demonize me, again, as an Islamophobe, but now there was this added element that I'm somehow a racist. They literally use that word, and somehow an enabler of white nationalism, which they say is already a big problem in the Army. And basically, if I get to speak before the Army about this topic, I'm going to radicalize them to the point that they're going to go out and start murdering Muslims in the streets of America and abroad, which is what they said in their petition and screed. And I thought, since the first formal letter didn't work, surely this won't either, but lo and behold, it did. And the War College, I think maybe 2 days after this campaign started, the screed, the press release, the petition, they called me and they said, well, we're going to postpone the event, which basically meant they canceled what we agreed to. And they until this day, they won't admit that it was because of CAIR and all this Islamist activism, demonization, smear campaign. They just don't even have a real reason why they postponed it, even though they postponed it nearly 5 months after we settled on a date, and 1 week before schedule, and just a couple of days after the smear campaign. So it's obvious why they're canceling. And so that's basically it in a nutshell.
Raymond, your book has a ton of detailed history. You have an 11-page bibliography. You have a ton of footnotes, your own. You've done translations from original Arabic sources. You're fluent in Arabic and Greek. You have a degree under Victor Davis Hanson. On the back, you have commendations from Victor Davis Hanson, Thomas Madden, Paul Crawford, James Lindsay, and Dario Fernandez Morera, who has an awesome book on the history of Islamic Spain. You have great scholars commendating your work. You have multiple degrees. You're fluent in multiple languages. Why does CAIR not want your book to be known by people?
Well, that's just it. For starters, even though in their petition and letters and in their entire campaign, they do mention the book, but they don't once cite anything wrong with it. They just keep saying it's a wrong book. It advances it mischaracterizes, et cetera, et cetera. It's ahistorical, but they don't show you one sentence that's that they can argue is wrong. But I think the point of the book, what they're trying to suppress, is basically the book doesn't. I think they're used to the doctrinal approach. They're used to people quoting the Quran, quoting Muhammad, the Hadith, Sunnah, and they have their mechanisms to get by that. They can say, there's different interpretations, and that works with the postmodern Western mentality, which already is acquainted with having scriptures, its own biblical scriptures, and they know Christians and Jews, for example, ignore so many of their own scriptures, interpret them. So I think a lot of people in the West are not moved by that argument. I think it's a good argument, the doctrinal argument. I myself have made it. But I think when people see in the book it's a historical argument, which is much harder to do. This book, I've technically been working on this book, you can say almost for 2 decades, because that's when I really started researching. And the first chapter is based on my master's thesis, which was almost 2 decades ago. So it's much harder to put this together, but here it is put together. And what you will find out is basically that groups like ISIS, who were repeatedly told have nothing to do with Islam, are criminal, gangster, terrorist organizations. The book will show you that actually that ISIS behavior, the way ISIS talks, the way ISIS acts against quote unquote infidels is the mainstream. This is exactly what Islam did vis-a-vis the West for well over a millennium. The book starts with, it centers around 8 pivotal battles in 8 chapters. And the first one starts in 636, and the last one, Siege of Vienna, is in 1683. But I go into even past that. For example, the Barbary Wars, 1800s. But the point is, all the Muslim attackers use the ISIS logic of saying the Quran compels us to wage war on you. You are an infidel. You either have to pay us tribute, jizya, or you have to, and basically be second, third class citizens, or you have to fight to the death. That's what they said. That's what they did for well over a millennium. And the problem is now CAIR can't come and say, can't play the interpretation game. This is history. This is actually what has happened, and it's been one unwavering line. So I think, and since they can't debunk it, since they can't debate it, they just try to suppress it. And so one other point I forgot to mention is, in my last phone call with the War College, when I tried to keep our date, I said, fine, let's cancel it from being a lecture, from me lecturing, and turn it into a debate, and have CAIR bring any historian they want to debate me on this topic. And they said no. So I think that's the thing. You can play around with doctrine and scriptures, but when people see history and it's one unwavering ISIS-like behavior for over a millennium, it's very hard to say that's an interpretation, or that's not right, or that doesn't represent Islam. And you find this happening historically. It's interesting because when we talk about history, usually historians, what they'll say is they'll talk about the Arab conquests, or they'll talk about the Moorish, presence in Spain, or they'll talk about the Tatar yoke against the Russians. But you'll find out that in all of these are different manifestations of Islamic jihadi invasions. So whether it was the Arabs or the Persians or the Mongols or the Berbers or the Moors or the Turks or the Tatars, they all spoke like ISIS. They all quoted the Quran. They all said what we're doing is jihad. They all did what they did to Europeans and Christians and others in the name of jihad. So that's not easily brushed aside, I think, when you see how universal and nonstop and manifesting in different nationalities and ethnicities, all in the name of Islam it was.
And when people look at your book, they will see that what's ridiculous about CAIR saying that things are wrong is, like you said, they have not even quoted one sentence from your book saying this is wrong and this is why, and then giving some type of response, alternative explanation of what happened. You're actually quoting Islamic sources. So it's even harder for them to try to refute, because you're using the primary sources themselves when you're pointing out to people this is actually what happened. Now, I think the reason why they wanted it canceled, of course, is because the subtitle of your book could easily be 14 centuries of Muslims killing non-Muslims. Because when you read through this book, that's what you're going to find all over the place. Now, of course, Raymond covers the battles where the Muslims lost. However, on average, this 1400 years has been Muslims subjugating non-Muslims and killing them, whatever, what have you. That is what you're going to find in this book. ISIS, Al Qaeda, these different jihadist groups are not an aberration of true Islam. And it'd probably be good to get away from this whole true Islam, radical Islam, these different terms that we use. We should just cut to the chase and just say Islam according to Muhammad, because that is what you find when you read the primary sources, and the primary sources are what Raymond talk about in this book. Now, Raymond, if you recall, I've tried to get a couple of debates set up for you over the last couple of years, and so far I've had no takers, because as soon as they read your bio, they suddenly come up with an excuse. No surprise there. Now, I told you when I first heard about the Army War College canceling your event, I said, Raymond, you should send CAIR a thank you letter, because your book sales are going to skyrocket. And it was probably like a day or two later, I saw it on Amazon. Your book became number 611 in every single book that Amazon sells. Number 1 in Christian church history, number 1 in Turkey history, and number 1 in history of Islam. And people are still buying all kinds of copies, and that's great, because guess what? CAIR tried to suppress it, but on a even more broad scale, people are reading the book who couldn't even have shown up to the live event anyway. So in the end, CAIR has actually helped to spread word about your book. More people are reading it now than were even reading it before. Now, the same time, even though this event has been canceled, you've actually had the National Association of Scholars get together and actually create a page to give you support. What's happening there on that website, and what happens when someone puts their name down there and signs that petition?
Well, honestly, I didn't even know about that until they told me. They actually reached out to me and told me they're sending out a letter. They were angry about this. They thought, because this is actually unprecedented, whereas we're familiar with advocacy groups or just people screaming bloody murder, causing colleges to disinvite whoever. Usually the colleges are private and already liberal and so forth. This is unprecedented because it's a military institution, and there hasn't been this kind of example before where a group, especially a shady group like CAIR, would come up to a military institution and start screaming and then have the military institution capitulate to them. So I think, and the National Association of Scholars, they mentioned that point. So that's, I think, what really concerns them, that it's getting from bad to worse now, this whole issue of clamping down on free speech to appease, whichever advocacy group. But they wrote that letter, as you said, and they've sent. It's supposed to be sent to the White House, and it actually asks Donald Trump to intervene in the matter. I think the most important thing isn't so much intervening in the matter as much as making sure this doesn't happen again to other people. And they do stress that as well in the letter. So that's good. And I know a lot of, it's also telling that a lot of scholars, it's mostly academics who are actually signing on to the letter. Last time I saw, I think it was well over 2,000 people had signed it. And most of them have university affiliations and medical institution affiliations and so forth. But they're all upset and want to see freedom of speech, which used to be a cherished right in this country, but obviously isn't anymore. So they're trying, like so many others, to get freedom of speech back onto college campuses, especially something like the War College, which needs to hear something like the historical context of the current conflict between Islam and the West.
Now, CAIR, unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation terrorism trial, is the Council on American Islamic Relations. They are the group who's been attacking you and making accusation against you, poisoning the well, saying that your book is full of falsities, yet they can't even name one and give any type of response to it. Now, they usually call people intolerant, racist, bigot, Islamophobes. They called you a white nationalist racist?
Well, they mostly, in their letters and their screeds, they basically say I'm promoting white nationalism, but there are a few instances where they refer to me as a quote-unquote racist. Even in the gloating letter, for example, most recently from CAIR, from Jacob Bender, who's head of their Philadelphia chapter, I think, who's a war college in Pennsylvania. He's the one that wrote the letter. He basically he's still not content that they canceled, and he says now you need to, and the word he uses is denounce Ibrahim's racist views. Well, if I have racist views, it means I'm a racist. Um, of course, missed out of all of this, or dropped and not mentioned, is the fact that I'm Egyptian on both sides of my family, ethnic, and I never talk about race because Islam's not a race. As far as race and ethnicity goes, I'm the same one that most Muslims are. So I'm not even referring to any of that. I'm talking about ideology, religion, history. But because they can't handle those, and they can't, they can't argue, they can't win the debate in that field, history and religion. So they just turn it about race and just shriek at the top of their lungs that I am a racist. And that the saddest part of all that is that the War College of all places capitulates to such shameful tactics that are on their face, just pretty pathetic, calling someone like me a racist, not being able to point out what I say wrong in my book and so forth, and coming from all people or from all organizations, CAIR, with its terrorist ties and backgrounds, being an unindicted co-conspirator of the largest terrorism fund case in U.S. history, having actual members and leaders being busted for terrorist charges, being being designated a terrorist organization in countries like the UAE, our ally. So, on all fronts, it's just bad. Who they are, the arguments they're using against me are pathetic, racism. And then of all people or organizations, the one that crumbles before this is the War College. So who on earth is ever going to be able to stand up against such absurd tactics?
And Raymond, you said it was shameful, and indeed it is, but that is actually part of the game. CAIR and all the Muslim Brotherhood front groups use peer pressure and the shame game to try to shut people up. No one wants to be called a racist. That's not a good thing. And what they've done is they've taken the terms that sound the worst, and they'll use those against people. Now, Ilhan Omar said in a recent event, this will not be a country of white people. So apparently, Raymond, she was referring to you. And CAIR is also attacking anyone and calling them racist or calling them, whatever name they feel that they need to call them. And for the longest time, CAIR has attacked the lowest hanging fruit, per se. They've attacked the people who seem the easiest to discredit. They'll call them names, and they do it in hopes that people will not listen to them. And of course, if someone's called a racist, people will just take that at face value. Oh, they're racist. I don't want to listen to them. Now, you are someone who has multiple degrees. You're fluent in multiple languages. And we're at that point now in America where they are now moving up and attacking people with the best credentials out there. Not only that, but what they do whenever someone is in a position of power or influence, they will be attacked. They don't care so much, again, about the low-hanging fruit, but if they are a mayor, a governor, any type of position of power, CAIR will attack that person, try to discredit them, try to get them fired. Again, peer pressure in the shame game. Now you have your own website. You write stuff all the time. You don't have an employer to fire you, to pressure you. So what do they do? They just call you names, try to discredit you. But again, thanks be to God, your book sales have skyrocketed even more than before, and people are actually getting the information for themselves. Now, when people go to your website, they will also see how you had an article about Alan West. He, of course, a military veteran, and he has stood up for you as well. What other people have stood up for you that you haven't actually had a chance to write about yet?
Several people. The Washington Times has written 2 articles, one a news report and one was an op-ed by another lieutenant colonel. Alan West is, I'm pretty sure, is a lieutenant colonel, retired. This one's also retired. Joseph C. Myers wrote an op-ed entirely about this, and it really takes a good look at who CAIR is and what they do, and their deep links to the Muslim Brotherhood and the Muslim Brotherhood's self-named, self-described civilizational jihad against America. So that's a good one. The Western Journal's written a couple of articles about it. CBN News recently, Gary Lane, the Global Lane, recently did a video with me. I-24 News. I just found out right now, actually, today came out, it's called, I think, The College Fix. It's I think it's a paper or or website dealing with college matters, and they wrote a report about it that just came out today. So it's around. It's not on the big media for whatever reason. Fox News doesn't want to talk about it, even though it seems newsworthy that the War College, of all places, is caving into terrorists. But it's getting enough traction, and I've gotten a lot of emails. I've met with Congress members actually, and who I believe are actually drafting a letter that they're sending to the War College, and might actually be setting up some meetings about it. So it's getting fair. It's getting what it needs to get actually, and I'm happy about that. Like I said, this isn't about re-inviting me because they canceled the event, and I don't really. Well, once they canceled it, that's the end of it. But it'd be good to fix this so this doesn't continue happening, so that it's just an aberration, not a new precedent that now is going to be the case for anyone and everyone who wants to talk on these sorts of controversial topics.
Definitely. And speaking of aberration, of course, that's something that CAIR will attack you for as well, and that's probably why they've tried to suppress your book. I mean, you not only have, again, 1,400 years of Muslims attacking non-Muslims and trying to make Islam supreme, make it prevail over all other religions. We find in the Quran, chapter 48:28. On page 52 here, you actually quote a very reliable source, a man named John of Damascus. He actually worked for the Caliph Abdul Malik, and he's the one who had the Dome of the Rock built on top of the Temple Mount. He had talked about the epithets that were used for Muhammad, even in the late 600s. You talk about the false prophet, the hypocrite, the liar, the adulterer, the forerunner of the Antichrist, and the beast. These are just some of the names that were used for Muhammad, again, in the late 600s. And this is when Islam was spreading. You quote not only Islamic sources, which who's going to actually refute those. You're also quoting Christian historians, Christians who dealt with Muslims back then. And when you read your book, you see that what they're doing in there, as you said earlier, lines right up with what ISIS was doing and what the jihadist groups are doing. Raymond, if people are just getting into studying Islam right now for the first time, and they're seeing this show, and they are hearing people say, like CAIR will say, ISIS, they're not Islamic, or they're outside the fold of Islam, or what have you. Please explain to people what you find when you actually read the Quran, the Hadith, the things that Muhammad said, the Surah literature, which are the biographies, Tahri, the Al-Tabari, the 39-volume set of history of the world according to Islam, and the Tafsirs. These are the primary sources of Islam. What do you find in there if you're trying to figure out who is following Islam according to Muhammad?
Well, what you just mentioned are basically usul al-fiqh, or basically the origins of all Islamic thinking or epistemology, the Quran and the Sunnah and those other ancillary writings. What you find is basically ISIS-like behavior, of course. You find everything that ISIS says and does is recorded in there. In fact, that's where ISIS gets it from. And the history, and this is why I think it was important to lay out the history is one long manifestation of those doctrines. So instead of it just being an abstract, here's what the issue has long been. The problem is the Islamists and the left have controlled the historical narrative for generations. And according to the historical narrative they've created, the pseudo-history, which everyone buys into, including anti-Islamists, anti-Sharias, all the people in the West who are anti-Islam actually buy into this history. And they don't think it's important because it's history, but it's very important. And this narrative basically says that Islam was progressive, civilized, tolerant in the pre-modern era. And then something went wrong. And so as you may recall, after 9/11, the big questions that everyone was asking was what went wrong and why did they hate us? And both those questions presuppose that pseudo-history that I mentioned, that something was right and they didn't hate us. But that's not the case. So when you look at the true history, you find out it is, like I said, one manifestation of the doctrines, which are violent. So as I said, the doctrines can be sidelined. People can say, well, historically, Muslims didn't do that. Muslims were progressive. Look at Andalusia. Look at the multiculturalism. Obviously, we can't blame Islam. And that's how we descend into the whole, well, it must be economics. It must be education. It must be grievances. It must be anger at Israel. All these sorts of reasons are now the mainstream explanation, since we can't say it's a historical issue. But if you find out that the true history is in fact one long ISIS in jihad on the West, and that the hate was there from the very beginning, and proclaimed and articulated just the way ISIS does, then there are no questions about what went wrong. Why did they hate us? Because it was there from the beginning, and the default answer obviously becomes it's a part of Islam, and that's the case. People aren't aware that when ISIS or Al Qaeda or all these Islamic terror groups say things like, we've tasted American blood and we find none sweeter, or we love death as much as you love life, they're actually taking out the verbatim quotes of Islam's early heroes and quoting them in a way to it's a message to the Islamic world to understand what they're doing, and to essentially put themselves and show themselves in their footsteps. So those particular claims, we like Khalid bin al-Walid, the sword of Allah, in the year 636, almost 1400 years ago, he actually was the first to say to a Byzantine emperor that we've tasted Roman blood and we find none better, and that's why we've come to kill you. He also said, we love life, we love death as much as you love life. So whereas in the West, ISIS says this to America, no one has any clue what they're talking about, and they think they're just being poetic. In the Islamic world, they know exactly what they're talking about, and they understand exactly whose footsteps they're putting themselves in. So, that's why I think history is very important. History very much validates the doctrine, and it really gives it substance. So it's not just a theoretical, abstract thing, whereas we say Islam used to be peaceful, and now there's radicals in the modern era who are twisting it. You see in history, actually, no, that was the mainstream interpretation. It manifested repeatedly, as I said, through all these different ethnicities and nationalities over the centuries. And there's just no way to get by that. That's why a group like CAIR would rather just, scream hysterically and keep shouting out the word racist mindlessly, rather than actually debate it or try to actually address it intellectually.
And this is exactly what many people claim, Raymond. They'll think about their lifetime and maybe their parents' lifetime, and there's so many claims that this jihad activity, this radical Islam, quote unquote, started with the Ayatollah. Oh, it just started then. That was the origin of all this. Or they'll say, oh, it was it was 9/11. It was the Ayatollah. Or maybe they'll say, oh, Wahhabism, which I don't hear people saying as much now. But he wasn't born till the 1700s, so you can't blame centuries of Islamic conquest on him. We go right back to the sources themselves. We go back to the codifiers of Islamic jurisprudence. We go back to the Quran, again, all the primary sources of Islam. Please take 30 seconds to explain to our audience why they should buy and read your book, rather than, say, Karen Armstrong or John Esposito, who CAIR loves to quote and point people to.
Well, the first and foremost reason people should buy it, I think, at this point, and why they are buying it, as you said, is when a group like CAIR that's linked to Islamic terrorism says, don't read this book, well, what do people do? They actually, they want to read it. So I think that's the first thing. And the second thing, as far as the other people you mentioned, they're perfect examples. John Esposito has a line in one of his histories where he says, 5 centuries or 4 centuries of peace between the Islamic world and the West went by before a papal power play blew up and the Crusades started. And since then, there's been mistrust. Well, half the book actually occurs before the Crusades. And you're going to see how for 4 or 5 centuries, Islam was bombarding Europe. In fact, it swallowed up 3/4 of the original Christian landmass or Christendom. And so those Karen Armstrong, Espositos, they're presenting that pseudo history that I'm talking about. They don't even quote from primary sources, or they cherry pick whatever one sentence they can find that fits their narrative. Whereas with mine, I just brought out what was the mainstream, what was being said from the primary sources, both Christian, European, and Islamic. And they completely contradict one another. So, Armstrong and Esposito and CAIR have their own authority. I'm not using my authority. My authority is the sources, the people who lived in those times and saw these events and wrote about them.
Excellent. Raymond Ibrahim, thank you so much for being here on Colliding Worldviews once again.
Thanks a lot, Tony.
Friends, rather than listening to CAIR, rather than listening to Karen Armstrong and John Esposito, if you don't want a watered-down, sugar-coated Walt Disney version of Islam, you need to get Raymond's book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. Get it on Amazon, wherever fine books are sold. Get a case of them and give them out to other people. Again, this is the book that CAIR does not want you to read. This is the book that they wanted to suppress at the U.S. Army War College. Support Raymond Ibrahim. Go to RaymondIbrahim.com. Sign up for his newsletters, his daily updates. You'll get all of the different articles that he writes. Again, most importantly, get this book. Also, you might want to get the previous books that he wrote. He wrote one called Crucified Again, which is about Christian persecution and many years of that. He also wrote the Al-Qaeda Reader, and that gets into the mind of the jihadists and why they do what they do. Also, you can get The Battle of Yarmouk. That is the master's thesis that Raymond wrote that is now available on Amazon as well. Well, God bless you, and thank you so much for being here with us. Again, go out and share the gospel with all people, and all people includes all Muslims. We'll see you next time on Colliding Worldviews.